Welcome to The Big Deal. I'm Errol Louis, national political anchor at Spectrum News. Every week we look at some of the biggest issues shaping our nation and the road to the White House. This week, both presidential campaigns kept their focus on the economy. During a rally in North Carolina on Wednesday, former President Donald Trump criticized President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris for their handling of the economy and inflation under their watch. 2 days later, Harris held her own rally in North Carolina to lay out her own economic agenda. Harris is proposing a number of plans to lower costs related to housing, grocery prices, childcare, and healthcare, all as part of her 100-day plan if elected. This all comes as Democrats prepare for their national convention next week, which we will bring you a preview of later in tonight's program. Meanwhile, here's a look at some of the key moments in politics from this week.
When I left office, I handed Kamala and crooked Joe Biden a surging economy with no inflation. Harris and Biden blew it all up.
Donald Trump fights for billionaires and large corporations. I will fight to give money back to working and middle-class Americans.
Joining me now to talk more about all of this, I've got two of the best in the business. Tim Boyum is a political anchor for Spectrum News 1 in Raleigh, North Carolina. Cassie Semien is a political reporter for Spectrum News in Washington, D.C. And Tim, the big theme and focus this week, of course, was the economy. Now, you interviewed the former president this week ahead of his rally in your state, North Carolina. Was Donald Trump proposing strategies that a president can actually implement, or was he kind of just joining the rest of us in complaining about the cost of living?
Well, there's a lot of the complaining going on all over the country. There's no question about that. I think this is a lesson that the Americans need to learn, that to do a lot of what they're going to hear on the presidential campaign trail is that they need to pay attention to the races for Congress, because most of what Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are proposing will need congressional approval. When I talked to Donald Trump and when he spoke in North Carolina, we heard things like no tax on tips, drill baby drill, a lot of these kind of bumper sticker themes that are populist. But there's a lot of details we're not still getting. Kamala Harris has been talking about this $25,000 credit for down payment on a new home. She's talking about a lot of individual policies, but in some ways lacking that bumper sticker thing. But to answer your question, largely speaking, most of this needs congressional approval. And so right now, it's interesting to watch them sort of both put out these populist ideas out there. But to get what's needs to get done, they need Congress for almost all of it.
Okay, so now, Cassie, you were at a government event that President Biden and Vice President Harris held to celebrate the administration, what they're calling a victory in bringing down the cost of prescription drugs. And it was hosted by the White House, even though it sort of had the look and feel of a campaign rally. What was the substance of how they say they're bringing down costs for consumers?
Yeah, this was a celebration essentially of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed into law 2 years ago, that gave Medicare the power to actually negotiate drug prices. These were the lowering of 10 drugs, the most expensive drugs for people on Medicare, the most likely prescribed drugs. And we will see those prices go down for consumers starting in 2026. This has been a core tenet of the Biden-Harris administration, lowering drug costs for everyday Americans. This is something that they were celebrating, that they were able to accomplish this. And it did have that feeling of a campaign rally. This was the first time we saw President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris together since he dropped out as the party's nominee and passed the baton to her. And he said to the crowd, she is going to make one hell of a president. There was a lot of chants and cheers and thank you, Joe, and, looking forward to the future and having Kamala Harris continue on that legacy. And we saw today in North Carolina, she tried to continue to push that narrative forward, that she is going to focus on continuing to lower the cost of prescription drugs if she is elected.
Okay, now you've been out on the campaign trail, Cassie. The running mate of Kamala Harris, Governor Tim Walz, began campaigning solo this week. I know you went to his home state of Minnesota to talk with some of his constituents. Let's listen to a little bit of what you heard and have been reporting.
I am very, very sad to lose him here in Minnesota just because he has been so effective. But I'm really hoping that what he's done for Minnesota, he can do for the rest of the country.
Walz has done nothing but let Minneapolis burn.
Yeah.
With all that was going on and everything, with all this George Floyd stuff.
Okay, so some like him, some not so much. Cassie, what should we expect from Walz as a solo act? Is he doing the usual running mate's job of kind of beating up on the other side?
He's definitely taken that attack dog stance when it comes to Republicans and the ticket, but we're also seeing him go to places like Nebraska, trying to connect with his roots. That's the state where he's from, where he was born and raised before him and his wife Gwen moved to Minnesota and he began his political career. But they are relying on him to really connect with some of the rural voters in these swing states, like Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin, like Michigan, like Minnesota. We know that Democrats do really well in the cities. It's the rural areas that they struggle with. And we heard a mixed bag of reviews when we spoke to voters on the ground in Minnesota. But the Harris ticket and Democrats really as a whole up and down the ballot are hoping that his folksy Midwestern dad persona that he's really embraced on the trail, and it seems like voters are embracing, will help them this fall reach some of the voters that really have gone more towards Donald Trump in the last several years.
Tim, there's been some advice floating around from strategists who say that Donald Trump should be honing in on winning issues like the economy and like immigration rather than resorting to personal attacks. Now, Spectrum News has been traveling around and speaking to Trump supporters all around America who actually gave some similar advice to the former president. Let's take a listen.
Keep it positive is more than anything. Yet they need to attack her record, not her as a person.
I wish he wouldn't go after her and go on to his policies and what he did to make the country better.
Let's all stop the name calling and just, tell us what you stand for and run on that.
And, those are his supporters, Tim. But, as we saw during his press conference in New Jersey, Donald Trump had a whole setup of groceries behind him to talk about the price of food and so forth. But he went right back to mocking his opponent, saying that he's entitled to personal attacks. Is that a viable path to victory?
I think Republicans are very concerned it's not. I feel like it's one of those situations where they need to tell him the opposite. Remember during the Republican National Convention, everyone was saying, yay, we're going to unite. He needs to unite everybody. And then after the first 20 minutes in that speech, he went back to kind of the old Donald Trump that everybody knows. There is great concern about that within the Republican Party. But even this week, when aides were talking to me about the interview that I was going to conduct with President Trump, they were sort of pitching things up to say, he'll get riled up if you talk to him about this. So even aides within his own campaign are sort of teeing him up to what they know he likes to talk about, trying to please him and make him happy what he's talking about. But Republicans in North Carolina, and frankly, the ones I've talked to across the country, they're very nervous. And they believe if he sticks to the immigration and economic issues that they'll win. And if he doesn't, there's some concern.
And in our last few seconds, Tim, your state seems like it's very much in play. I think Kamala Harris made her 8th or 9th visit just this week.
Yeah, it was the 8th visit. The polls are showing within the margin of error, although I'll caution, I think it was always going to be in the margin of error. Trump won by just 74,000 votes in 2020. But the governor of North Carolina today at the Harris rally said it feels like 2008. If it is, they got a chance.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Cassie. We're going to take a break now, and when we come back, we'll talk about the rising political influence of South Asians and how representation on both sides of the aisle could affect the presidential election.